I was asked a question, asked for some advice last week, actually from another ministry leader, and she wondered how to manage this issue, and she'd wondered if I'd ever been asked this question before. And the question has to do with families where you have a mother and a father who are Christian, and then in this particular iteration of the question, the father deconstructs and deconverts and becomes a non-Christian and maybe even becomes an atheist. And there's children that had been being raised in a Christian family. So they have a Christian familial community. They're giving thanks at meals. They're going to church on Sundays and maybe to other Christian events. Maybe the father and or mother are making regular investments in the spiritual life of the children, and that's all bearing fruit. And then something happens. Dad's not so sure. Dad's wondering if Christianity is actually true. Dad is deconstructing, and then Dad deconverts. And the question then is, what now? And specifically, especially for Mom, what now for Mom? What does she tell the children? When does she tell the children? Should she tell the children, or should Daddy tell the children that he doesn't believe in God anymore? And what age is going to be the best time to do that? And also, if, let's say, Dad is playing along a little bit for the sake of the family, and that for good men who have genuine challenges to their confidence in Christianity, they are likely to play along for the sake of the family by maybe going to church regularly or maybe occasionally, or by offering a prayer at the meal or at night with the kids, even though they don't actually believe in what they're doing on behalf of the children. And then will telling the kids about this changed belief cause seeds of doubt in the children. Or keeping it from them even when Dad isn't playing along at all, will that cause damage to them later on? So this is a very real situation. I have never been asked this question before. I have never thought about it, about the kids. Obviously, there are occasions when a husband and wife are not Christian and one's become a Christian. Now what? Or they're both Christian and one leaves their faith. Not necessarily the marriage, but now what? Okay, well, that's come up. This is unique because the question is, now what with the kids? And the kids are moving along on a good trajectory with their Christian faith in a way that's consistent with their age and everything else. Now what? Okay, so I had to think about this for a while. And I made a few phone calls. I talked to Amy. I talked to Tim Barnett. And just that their reflections were helpful to me. And you may be in the circumstance I just described. You may be in that circumstance sometime in the future. I don't know. Or you may be talking to somebody who's in that situation and you're not sure how to respond. So let me talk about three things that came to mind when I thought about this particular challenge, okay? And one of the things that Tim pointed out, and this has to do with the timing, when do you tell your kids about this change in Dad's perspective? Tim pointed out that there are all kinds of variables, and a lot depends on the age of the child, on the maturity level of the child, on the temperament of the child. Notice I'm talking about the child. Well, wait a minute, what if there's like 3 or 4? Well, you still have to think about the individual children. Okay? And what Tim suggested is, when do you tell your kids about sex? So you got 4 kids, and they have varying ages. When do you tell them about sex? Well, you tell them when they're ready for it. But they're not all ready at the same time. And so you have to choose what seems to be an appropriate time to tell the individual people, the individual children about this particular issue when you think they're ready. So there's a point here where you may have to say, I'm going to stagger this. The older kids I'm going to talk to, or we're going to address this with, and then maybe the younger kids will address it with. Okay, so that's a factor. I'm not giving a hard and fast rule here. I'm giving a factor. And by the way, if the children are young, in preschool or early grammar years, and I'm using grammar here in the trivium terminology. So you have grammar, you have logic, and you have rhetoric. Grammar is roughly grammar school. Logic is roughly middle school, and the rhetoric stage is roughly high school. Okay, so when you have kids in that those early grammar years, I don't think anything needs to be said. And that's especially if dad is still willing to be supportive of the family's views by going to the church with the rest of the family or carrying on a little bit like that. Because what do kids that young know? They're not putting all this stuff together. They're just thinking that we're Christian, we're a family, we go to church, we go to Bible study, we pray before meals, we talk about Jesus or whatever. So I don't think you need to upset the apple cart when the kids are really young like that, my opinion, okay? And I don't think it's going to appear as hypocritical since younger kids are not making those kinds of distinction. Like I said, going to church is just what they do. Okay. Now, when it becomes obvious that dad is not participating in the family's spiritual life, if he's not, then this might be the time to begin suggesting some things to the children. And if they're older, if there are older and younger children, then it might be best to communicate to the group when the youngest one is old enough to manage it. Then you give it to them all together. Kind of depends on the timing of when this happens. If you have an 8-year-old, a 10-year-old, and a 12-year-old, and that's when dad deconverts, well, you might be able to tell them all at the same time. They're probably old enough to be able to manage this. Okay, but there are individual issues. There are these kinds of variables. Okay, I just don't think there's a hard and fast rule on this. But now it comes to the question of who does the communication. And I do have a strong opinion about this. I think the Christian mom should be the one who communicates this, not the atheist or non-believing dad. There's a couple reasons I suggest that. For one, when mom speaks to the children about where dad is at, she can speak candidly with them. And I don't mean she's going to be nasty or mean or speak ill of dad when he's not there. That's not what I mean. But you can imagine when you're trying to explain something like this to the children and trying to find the right words and whatever, it adds to the complication if dad, the non-Christian now, is standing there looking over your shoulder while you're trying to explain it. You don't want that distraction. You want to be able to choose the words that you think are appropriate without trying to second-guess dad's response. That's what I'm getting at, okay? Plus, I think the children, if mom's doing the explaining without dad there, the children will likely have the freedom to respond more candidly, too. If dad's there, they may not feel like they can say what they're feeling, and they need to be able to express themselves, it seems to me. So they'll be more free, and that's important. They'll have the freedom to speak their mind and be honest about their feelings. Here's another element, though, and that is that, just saying here, moms are usually better at being compassionate when talking about sensitive issues like this, all right? And I'm saying that as a guy. I get it. Guys are just a little crustier. They're harder. Even guys that have an ability to be gentle, they're still guys. So a lot of times there's a certain touch or manner that mom brings to the table when there are difficult issues like this that will make it easier for the kids. And they can better affirm with the children the family's love for dad, even if he doesn't agree with them. And this is really important. You don't want to create a rift here. Moms need to be able to say, hey, darlings, I want you to know that Dad doesn't believe in Jesus or God like we do anymore. He might come to church with us sometimes, or he might pray, but his beliefs are different at this point, and that makes us sad. But we're going to love Dad anyway, and we're going to pray for him, okay? And we're going to respect him. He's still Dad. He's still the leader of our family. And reaffirming his leadership here is really, really important in my view, okay? And it reminds me actually of a scene of a movie from, 35 years ago? It was called a Steven Spielberg movie called Close Encounters of the Third Kind. And maybe you've seen this. If you haven't, it's really worth seeing. And Richard Dreyfuss is one of the main characters. He does a fabulous job. And it's all about aliens, right? And he has a close encounter of the third kind. A close encounter of the third kind is not just when you see like an alien, but when an alien interacts with you in some fashion. I think the fourth kind is when you're transported away by an alien or whatever. But anyway, so that's what this movie is about, this kind of encounter. And then as a result of this very close encounter with a spaceship, he begins to do weird things. And he's obsessed with this picture of a geographical feature in Montana, as it turns out. But he doesn't know. And at one point, he's sitting at the table, and he's been acting kind of weird. And his two kids and his wife are aware of this. And he sees his mashed potatoes in front of him, and he starts sculpting the mashed potatoes with his fork into this geographical thing. And everybody's slack-jawed looking at him. What's Dad doing? And then he pauses and looks up, and he sees him looking at him, and he says, well, I guess Dad has been acting a little strange lately, which is really true, the understatement, right? But then he says this, but I'm still Dad. But I'm still Dad. Fact is, dads do act strange, lots of times. But that doesn't mean they're no longer Dad, that they no longer have this position of authority. I certainly think it's possible to abrogate that position of authority. But just being weird or having different beliefs doesn't change the role that Dad has in the family, God-given, as the head of the family. And so when Dad is not following along and sharing the same religious convictions that Mom and the children are having, it is really critical that the children understand with Mom's support that we still treat Dad as Dad. He's still Dad. And we love him and we respect him and we'll pray for him. But insofar as it's consistent with Christ, we're going to obey him. He's still Dad. Okay. One other reason why I think it's important for moms to do the communication and not the dads about this is that when dads speak, their words, I'm chuckling, as a dad, their words often feel more forceful and authoritative, or even threatening to the children. Now, that's a plus for dads, because Mom would say, do this, do that, do this, do that, do that, nothing. Okay, Dad. And Dad steps in, and he says, no fussing, no noise, you do this right now. And there's something about having a man exercising his authority in that circumstance that has a greater impact on children than Mom trying to do the same thing. Okay? It's not a gross overgeneralization. Most of you know what I'm talking about. So, given that dynamic, if Dad is the one that tells the children that he no longer believes in Jesus and he doesn't even believe in God, you can see how this could have a much more forceful impact on the kids than if Mom were to communicate that information. All right? And that's a concern. You don't want that information to be perceived as threatening to them, even if it's not. Even if he's not trying to be domineering or overwhelming. Okay? Now, some I talked to said, well, maybe Dad really needs to be there to avoid driving a wedge in the family or something like that. That's not my view. I think it'd be better if mom did this. Now, it may be different if all the kids are teenagers. That is, they're all in the rhetoric stage. And then, kids in high school, they got opinions. They like to argue. Teenagers, right? And they like to think their idea, is better than somebody else's, even mom and dad's. Don't you know? And so there, it might be appropriate to have a more open discussion. And maybe then dad wants to explain himself. Here's why he's making these moves. But you don't want to have dad, let me put it this way, you don't want to have the children feel a lot of information that they are not capable of dealing with. If you got kids that have been raised on stand to reason, it's probably a little different circumstance for them. But nevertheless, you want to, this is one of those variables. If they're teenagers, then that could be more of a family discussion, all right? That between dad and mom or whatever, okay? And if dad raises a bunch of objections, here are the reasons why I don't believe in God. Just keep in mind, and mom, this is something you can coach the kids with, you don't have to answer every challenge right then. Might be good just to take an inventory of dad's reasons without trying to speak to them. If dad has reasons, chances are he's thought them through a little bit. And if he's thought them through a little bit, it's unlikely that any of the kids are going to disabuse him of those ideas. They're going to say, well, what about this? And he said, well, I thought about that, and here it is. So that's probably not going to be good for the kids. Just let them know, okay, we don't have to answer those challenges right now. It'd be good to find them out maybe. What are dad's reasons? And the idea there is that we're just seeking clarity, not agreement. We're not going to try to persuade dad. We just want to be clear where he's at and why he's there. And of course, that's standard tactical approach. What do you mean by that? How'd you come to that conclusion? You don't need to address the concerns right then. But now that you know what those concerns are, then, Mom, this is an opportunity for you to be with the kids and say, well, Dad thought this, but let me give you an answer to that challenge. Let's talk about this and make use of our material or others who've done a good job, I think, in speaking to some of these issues. But it's better that they have some time to debrief on these issues without Dad jumping in on them. And that seems just common sense when you think of the nature of those discussions. All right? Let me just see what else I want to say about this. One last thing, I guess. I mentioned there were three things. One is the timing. I talked about that. I said, second thing is, well, who's going to do the communication? I just said a few things about that. Here's a final thing, and this is between mom and dad. Ladies, moms, I think it would be wise to try to broker an agreement with dad. In other words, you get a commitment from him, the atheist, not to challenge the theism of the children. In other words, you're going to ask your husband, please don't try to convert our children from their current beliefs. Now, in a way, that might seem a little bit odd. Wait a minute. You're happy to teach them about your beliefs, and I can't try to convert them to my beliefs? That's what you're asking? And my response is that's exactly what we're asking. And there's a very important reason why. Why try to convert the kids to atheism? What is that going to benefit them personally? Even if you think that Christian theism is a false view, it actually serves them well at this time in their life. You know, there are people who are atheists or not religious at all who will say, well, it's good that kids are raised within a religion because they need to have something like that, a worldview, a moral system to follow. They need something like that. Even apart from this conversation, people acknowledge the value and the importance of kids believing something that will be an encouragement to them. What's wrong if they believe your kids growing up, contrary to fact, which is what the atheist thinks is going on, contrary to fact, that there is a God who loves them and will forgive all of their sins and is looking over them in a gracious, loving fashion. And we can turn to him when we're in trouble. Even if that's all false, what harm comes from that? So this is a pragmatic issue. Well, I don't see any harm that comes from that. But what harm would come from trying to disabuse children of this comforting thought about God by converting them to atheism? Well, no good is going to come from that. If they're in high school, that's going to be their choice. I'm not suggesting that what we try to do is like encourage a lie. But I don't think it's a lie. Mom, you don't think it's a lie. You think it's the truth. This is just a pragmatic concern when making the request. Please don't try to convert them. Because even if our views are false, it's doing something good for them right now. And taking away that what you think is a fantasy isn't going to help them. Not at this stage in their life. Maybe when they're in high school or college or whatever, but no. So what you're going to do is just try to broker that agreement. No, the husband may not agree, okay? But, you just got to do the best you can. Keep in mind, too, and this is fair to point out to Dad, you're the one who changed. We have all been growing up in our family with this set of beliefs that create harmony in our home. We all believe in the same, and then we're acting the same largely in light of our beliefs. Now you're going the other way. Okay, I get it. And in good conscience, you can't hold this. I get that too. But you're the one who's changed. Why ask everybody else to change? That really upsets the apple cart. Why ask everyone here's probably a better way to put it. I think the onus is on him to be considerate of and adapt to the status quo that the children have grown up with and have become accustomed to. Now, like I said, you may not get that agreement, but that to me seems fair and reasonable. All right? Nothing's at stake if atheism is true and Christians believe in God, and there are kids who believe in God. But there's a lot at stake if Christianity is true and kids are believing in atheism.